Welcome to the August 4th edition of Wine Stay. My name is Zach. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the beer and wine coordinator for Durham Co-op. Today we have Jason from Barrique Wine Imports. Is that the official title?
That's what we usually call it. It's okay. Barrique Wines LLC, but Barrique Wine Imports it often. Yeah. Okay. Be quiet.
We could do that spacebar trick we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. We'll figure that one out.
All right. So today we've got two French wines. We've got a Picpoul de Pinet, which is a personal summertime favorite, as well as a Touraine Chenonceaux. We're going to do some pronunciations with Jason this evening as well. Part of the fun thing about wine is figuring out what's inside the bottle, and that's why we do these events online. We're going to jump right in with the Picpoul, lovely white wine from the south of France. And cheers, everybody. And Jason, I'll leave it to you.
Get a little bit here. Cheers. Fun part about learning about wine for sure is learning about how to pronounce the wines, whether it be French wine, Spanish wine, Italian wine, whatever it is. And I've been importing French wine for 10 years. Came to it sort of, I'm a Francophile anyway, and probably came to French wine through loving the French language. So the pronunciation of these sometimes strange French wines has always been a little easy for me. That said, when you're talking about Italian wine or Spanish wine or whatever, I sound like, everybody else who's trying to pronounce, the name of a wine. So it's always difficult, but I think it's something worth learning for sure. Zach, do we want to talk about the Picpoul, or should I tell a little bit about how I got into the business? And
let's just mention like a few quick things. Everybody, please feel free to drink as we talk. And if you do have any questions, I think we can just mention just a handful of things about the Picpoul and then jump right into how you got into the biz, and then we can circle back. The whole point of these things is they are virtual wine tastings, so don't feel that you are being lectured to. Feel free to ask questions and enjoy yourself. That's what makes this, more of a social event with education versus just another, buttoned up. I've got my cardigan on, not my business suit today. So.
Cool. All right. We'll drink some wine and relax a little bit, and then get into the serious stuff. So Picpoul is interesting, and going back to names of wine. This is it's a wine where the name actually means something more than just a place name. Pinet is an area in the south of France. Picpoul is the name of the grape varietal. Often spelled the way it is on your bottle there, Picpoul. Sometimes they add a Q in there. Same variety. The word Picpoul means in I want to say it's in the Languedoc, the old language from the south of France, although it may be a Provençal dialect as well. It means lip stinger. It's a high-toned, not super high acidity, but pretty high on the acid scale for white wines, and bright, clean, zesty wine from right up against the sea in the south of France, right on the Mediterranean border. The producer we're drinking here is called the Domaine des Lauriers. They have been producing wines in this somewhat bucolic, remote area of the south of France since the late 60s, since 1969. The majority of their production is Picpoul. However, they do some other, they grow some other grapes, make some other wines. I've got another one here called, this is a wine that Zach has at the co-op. It's called Roll. It's Vermentino. And then they do a variety of other kind of Southern French white varieties, and then a few reds as well. So they produce a range of wines. All the wines they make are basically, you know, village wines that are meant to be drunk right there. They aren't wines that are really meant to be kept. They're sort of, you know, wines for the general local market. People in the area sort of tend to drink what's grown around them. And for, you know, decades, Picpoul has sort of just done nothing but serve the local markets in the south of France. Probably until, about when I started importing wine myself was probably the first time I ever even saw a Picpoul around.
Okay.
And going down there into the south of France and finding this wine about 10 years ago, it was, you know, kind of a big, should I bring this in or not? Because there isn't a lot of it and people might not really even care. But we did. And I think it's, you know, you're starting to see it a lot more.
But you take, right, is especially if you're finding these kind of unknown to the state varietals or styles of wine. I never heard of Roll until you showed up with the bottle. I mean, I'm familiar with Vermentino, which is what Roll is, you know, also grown as, but I had never heard of it before. And what's really cool about that bottle, it's about 2 bottles away from where the Picpoul is. It's kind of for me, the opposite of the Picpoul. So if you don't want that high tone acid, you don't want that like crispiness that this has, it's nice, more rounded, and has a really nice mouthfeel to it. It's kind of the fall and winter version of the Picpoul. So are wanting to try something else new at the co-op, and you like this wine, it's made by the same folks. So it's right there. So it's pretty cool. That's the reasons we do these things, is that if you learn a distributor or an importer, which is what Jason does, you know, stylistically, their wines typically fit into, you know, a range and of what the distributor likes to drink. And hopefully, you know, I also have a range of things that I like to see on the shelves, and, you know, feedback and all that kind of stuff. So really cool. So, I mean, as far as distributorship, how did you start?
So it's interesting that we're doing this wine actually, because it's like I said, it's one of the first wines I ever imported, and getting started in the business kind of happened around the trip where I discovered this winery. In the restaurant business for a long time prior to being officially in the wine business. Working as a sommelier in a small French restaurant in Seattle, Washington. Went to graduate school in the UK and had some friends who just happened to have a house in the south of France, some English friends. And so I'd get invited down there, you know, a couple times a year. So I ended up spending a fair amount of time in the what's called the Midi. It's not technically Provence, but it's the south of France, some sort of near Picpoul here. And one time I was down there, in the village where we would go, there was a winemaker who's actually still in my portfolio now, and we became friends. And he was, I think we were just hanging out at his winery. He has this really, honey, just be quiet, okay? He's got a beautiful place down there in Provence. And I think he was sort of complaining about the US market and about why he was not in the US market, and, you know, just that he hadn't tried and didn't want to try, and how difficult it was. And I said, well, I work in a restaurant that would sell your wines. I'm sure if we could just get them there. And then he's like, well, why don't you just bring them in and do it then? You know, it was kind of like a joking thing. And I remember flying home from that trip, thinking, maybe I should do that, but I can't just do one winery. And, you know, it just kind of evolved in my mind from there. And then 6 months later, I was on a solo trip going back down there with a list of wines, the contacts I had made just via email, just searching people out, and just kind of went off knocking on doors, honestly, and put together at that point, gosh, probably 6 wineries that were willing to even talk about it. And, the rest is history. It's sort of, in the subsequent 10 years until now, it's grown a lot, it's contracted a lot, we've moved it across the country, it's gone through various different phases, and now here we are. So now it's basically, we're small importers, distribute in North Carolina, generally to small shops, and very, very limited retail. Zach's really kind of on the short list there. So
yeah. And I appreciate that. One of the cool things about the co-op is that now that I have a wonderful assistant, but we get to choose what's on the show, what we think, both stylistically as well as talking to folks, what belongs on there. I love this Picpoul. There's tons out there. I have this one. I think it represents what Picpoul does very nicely as far as that kind of saltiness. Excuse me. It reminds me of Albarreño sometimes, as far as that almost stone fruity. What Jason and I were talking about earlier today is what's called garrigue, which is this kind of like herby, tumbly thing that happens in the Languedoc where this is from. And you get this nice, herbaceous kind of wild note buried in. And I think it's just add some complexity to what is typically viewed as a simple, white vinegar and salt, and that's about it. This actually has some texture to it, and I just really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen as well about this wine. I've got a couple of things today. This is, so as we've seen before, this is a tech sheet. Tech sheets are what producers send to me with them as we taste wines, and it gives you the varietal breakdown, a little bit about the location. So the fact that this winery's been around since 1969, pretty cool. Soil breakdown, which you can get a lot of the terroir aspects from that, how the wine was actually made. So not just we squished grapes and put it into a barrel and then 6 months later this happens, but the fact that they realized that to preserve that acidity, they need to limit the oxygen. They do what's called cold stabilizing. So wine is naturally high in tartaric acid, which is basically cream of tartar. So if you're a baker out there, the wine industry used to be the main provider of tartaric acid. And they used to basically just scrape the inside of the barrels, and then they realized, that they could just produce it now. And if you've ever seen some clear crystalline sediment in the bottom of a white wine glass, it's usually just a tartaric concentration. So the level is too much, all nice in chemistry and science wise, it'll kind of fall out of solution. It's totally harmless. You can refer to them as wine diamonds if you want to be kind of fancy about it. But all of that goes into this little sheet that kind of gives you, again, a snapshot of what's in the bottle. And thankfully, the hard part of my job is that I get to taste along as we're reading these things and kind of as we're doing tonight. So pretty tasty stuff, I must say.
Yeah, I would definitely, I completely agree with talking about the garrigue a little bit. Generally, you don't often think about garrigue when you're thinking about white wines for whatever reason. But there's no reason why you wouldn't. These vineyards are sort of, as most vineyards in the south of France are sort of just carved out of this it's sort of like if you're familiar with the California chaparral, it's sort of like scrub oak with herbs and olives, and it's the very mature state of the flora in the area surrounding the entire Mediterranean, and it really does impart very intense flavor profile to wine, red in particular, but white as well. So yeah.
And another important thing we've talked about is where these things come from. So this orange area right on the bottom of the screen there is Languedoc. So this is where we're talking about. And then you get into Provence and Rhone and all that kind of fun stuff. And this is kind of where we're talking about. So right here in this tiny little chunk of land, which they produce quite a bunch of things. They're more known for their reds in Languedoc than their whites. But I think this is a nice little kind of, stunner that we get. And another thing, if you're interested in wine, want to learn more, Wine Folly is a really good, easy website to use, kind of breaks down things nice and easy. And this little flavor profile is from them. And I think it's pretty, spot on. That garrigue, that thyme that we were just talking about, that saltiness comes through really nicely. You can see this really high acidity on the bottom. No tannins, because white wine, we do have some orange wines at the co-op that will have some texture for a white wine, which is becoming more in fashion. They're definitely love or hate, or there's versions of them that are love and hate. Where this, I don't really, this is nice and easy. Go ahead, Alexander.
May I ask, is it the high acidity that gives it the crisp, sharp flavor?
Yeah, so that for acidity, if you hold it in your mouth and you swallow, you'll kind of feel the sides of your tongue start to salivate. And that's that kind of crisp, like kind of almost hard edge that the wine has. You find it in quite a few wines, Sancerre, Chablis, more of the cold weather white wines. The opposite of that would be like California Chardonnay, as far as like kind of opulent and big and almost flabby and mouth filling, but in a good way, if that's your thing. Where this has that kind of quickness to it, and that's what I typically associate with acidity. I don't know, Jason, if you have any input on that.
No, that's exactly right. And acidity, generally comes from the skins of the grape itself rather than the inside of the grape, which is where all the sugars are concentrated. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that, exactly like what Zach said, is generally, wines with more acidity are wines in colder areas where you've got more skin and less inside. And in warmer areas, you get just the opposite. This is a very bizarre grape in that sense, in that we're right down in the hottest part of France. The Mediterranean Sea has some effect to sort of ameliorate the heat, but it still is quite hot. So it's just a very unique grape to be so highly acidic, even though it's grown in such a hot area. You'll find it also grown, Zach probably knows more than me about this, but they'll grow it like in some hot places in Washington State. They're starting to put that Picpoul in because it maintains some acidity, where other white grapes will just get overblown and flat, flabby, whatever you want to say. Picpoul just has a lot of, it's just basically the structure of the grape. The berries are smaller, so they're almost hardier, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. It's talking about the berry size. When we think of a grape, you're thinking of a table grape, the right. Size of a quarter, versus a wine grape, which can be like half the size of a dime or the size of a dime. So quite small. So that whole like flesh to skin ratio that Jason was just talking about, I think is very prevalent in that. As far as other places that Picpoul grows, I've got one from California right now. I've seen them from Washington. I've seen them from Oregon. Yeah, I don't think a lot of other places are, but it's just because it's not a very well-known grape, and it, a long time ago, just used to be turned into brandy or into a French version of grappa or marc or figue.
I'll tell you though, if you're in the south of France ever, I saw it on that text sheet and it reminded me, they have oysters in the Mediterranean, and you would think are not very good either, but they're actually excellent despite the warm water. And they're called bouzigues, and this wine is the perfect wine for them. It's like the Chablis or the Muscadet of the south of France. I mean, it's what they locally drink with the oysters down there. That's basically what it's for.
Yeah, you can almost kind of get that like ocean, like oyster shell if you smell.
Yeah.
And
And, you know, I mean, and there's something to that. I mean, there are sea breezes that are constantly flowing over the vineyard. Sea breezes are full of saline. Saline settles on the grapes. I mean, there's a reason you get a lot of salinity out of the wines. A lot of it is because there's actually, you know, salt water on the grapes when they're pressing them. So.
And this is, you know, as we're talking about, this is Mediterranean climate. So, you know, climate, terroir, all of that really affects grapes. You know, we mention this almost every time, that grapes are an agricultural product, and that, you know, vintage definitely can be a marker of things. I don't necessarily say in Languedoc because it's pretty consistent down there. Maybe some late frosts or some hail or something kind of like that. But you're getting, you know, these wines that almost always have typicity to them. So they're always like consistent, you know what you're getting in the bottle. And they definitely have some winners, you know, summertime, oysters, grilling out, I think are all easy things for this wine.
Yeah, this is very true. With the less vintage variation in the South, although who knows in the future, I'll tell you what, it's changing. So we'll see.
Yeah, climate change is definitely affecting what is growing where. We had some Bordeaux folks join us, and they were talking about planting Syrah in Bordeaux, which is crazy, you know, like never think of that grape there, but it is, you know, hardier to the heat. That's why it does so well in the Rhone Valley. And, you know, in Washington, it does really well, which is basically a desert. So they're kind of trying to adapt what is growing, and we'll see regions starting to change, unfortunately, or fortunately. You know, we're getting some pretty quality bubbles out of England right now, which I haven't found one that I'm in love with for the co-op yet, but I imagine seeing some English bubbles, if nothing else, just to mess with our amazing cheese guy, John. So if you are a cheese person, definitely go visit his counter. He's got a really amazing selection and knows quite a bit about cheese, and is always fun to talk to. But I digress. But yeah, so does anybody else have any questions about that? Cool. No? Great. Our second wine tonight is a really interesting blend from the Loire Valley. I'll go ahead and then throw up a big map of Loire. I've always been a fan of these wines. They're kind of fly under the radar depending on the appellation. You know, we've got things that are, again, if you liked the Picpoul, search out things from over here, which is where Muscadet is from. Grape is Melon de Bourgogne over there. And Muscadet sounds like Moscato. It is not anywhere close to that. It's much closer to the Picpoul or Albarino as far as like salty, high acid, nice and crisp. They do a lot of oysters over here too. But today we're actually, so here's Chinon, and then we're in Touraine. So we're right around this area, and we've got some more zoomed in maps of this. This is, you know, when I think of Loire, I think of two red grapes. I think of Cab Franc, and I think of Gamay. This is 20% Cab Franc, but then the majority is what's called Côte, which most people are familiar with, which is Malbec. And that's, you know, we typically think of that in France as being from either Cahors, which is right south of, southwest of Bordeaux, or from Bordeaux. Or if you hear Malbec, then you transport yourself all the way to Argentina, which is totally different stylistically. It's delicious. You know, again, another summertime kind of winter, nice and big and juicy. But something pretty special about this blend. And when he showed it to me a couple weeks ago, I was really happy to bring this in. And it's got, you know, definitely on that rustic side of what you get. Everybody wants to take a sip of this.
It's interesting. Yeah, so I mean, Cab Franc is such a distinctive grape, and generally it's the one grape that I always say in any kind of blind tasting, if you're learning how to blind taste wines, this is one that you can wrap your head around really quickly and really easily and identify it pretty readily. When you only have 20%, and then the rest of it is like a bigger, fuller bodied variety like Malbec, it becomes just like this really nice, interesting backbone to it, but really just kind of fills the wine out, gives it kind of a structure, but I can't just necessarily easily identify that this is, got 20% Cab Franc in it, but it doesn't taste like a big Argentine Malbec either. I mean, it's a completely unique wine and quite delicious. I mean, it's fun that we're doing this wine just because it is such a, it's not your typical wine, like Zach said, from the area for a red. Usually you're going to get 100% Cab Franc or Gamay. So yeah, quite cool.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Cab Franc. Basically Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc had a baby, which is Cabernet Sauvignon, which most people are familiar with. Malbec I find to be quite similar, not quite as bristly on the ends, where this, you take it into your mouth, it's pretty big. It's almost on the juicy side, but there's no like cooked fruit or kind of jammy character that you'll get in New World. But just a lot of these like fruit flavors, but then they kind of devolve into this like earthy, but not like wet earth, and just really delicious wine. I'm very excited to grill with this wine. I think this and even some spicy stuff I think would do pretty nicely. Here's the tech sheet for that as well. This is. Go ahead, Alexander.
Can I ask you? You've said grill with this twice. Do you mean drink with grilled foods? Oh, okay. I thought you meant cooking with this.
I mean, you could braise with this if you wanted to. Typically, when I'm doing braised dishes, I use higher acid wines. So Pinot Noir is classic for beef bourguignon, but things like Valpolicella or just higher acid reds for braising, I think, are what people typically use. I don't think that this has that kind of, the acid kind of helps break down the muscles when you're cooking, where this would be fine for, a nice, rich, big beef stew. But I think like some, pork chops or some ribs with a little bit of like that, kind of sweet hot barbecue sauce on there would do quite nicely with this.
Right. I agree.
So this is the tech sheet. Again, gives you the breakdown of the wine varietals, a little bit about the history. So like this, it's 4 generations, which is not exactly a young wine family. And again, terroir, so that the flintiness adds to basically kind of prevents the roots from finding water easier. So they're having to kind of break down further into the soil to find water, and then also kind of giving it a minerality to it, which we talked about last Wine's Day. For flint, if you have a Zippo lighter, you can kind of strike the wheel or a lighter, and that smell of not the lighter fluid, but the actual burning of the flint is an easy thing that most folks have around in their house. If you're wanting to smell flint, that's kind of a fun thing to do. If you're, again, as we're learning about wine, open up your spice cabinet and smell it. That's an easy way to kind of discover flavors, or when you're, using lime for your, Mexican inspired food, like smell the lime, taste the lime, taste the zest versus the flesh, and it really kind of can open your little like flavor descriptors a little more. And it's just, it's all about like the other flavors. That's the beauty about wine, is that you're turning something as simple as grapes and a little bit of yeast into things that taste, like rocks and brambles and blackberries, when there's none of those things in there, technically. But Jason, do you know the story of Côte, like why Malbec is called that?
No, I don't know. I don't know why the name is. I mean, the French language is just rife with, their own words that they, and just grapes in general often will have, various names for whatever reason. So just like that role we were talking about is also Vermentino. Just, I don't know what the history of that is. But going back to the Flint too, it's interesting, this area at Touraine is really best known for Sauvignon Blanc. I think you may have mentioned, and it's on that text sheet too, that that's what this winery actually grows mostly is Sauvignon Blanc. The Sauvignon Blanc, if you think about Sauvignon Blanc when you taste it, that's another grape that's very, very easy to sort of identify. It's kind of getting into wine. It really has a distinctive flavor profile, but the flavor profile really varies depending on where it's from.
Oh yeah.
And if you're drinking Sauvignon Blanc, say from New Zealand, versus Sauvignon Blanc, say from here, what you're going to get here predominantly is Flint. I mean, it is that smoke and that almost like match smoke or just kind of smoky Flint flavor. And that is precisely because these, you can kind of see where that arrow is pointed to there. That is kind of a downward slope going down into the share on both sides. And this whole area is just like Flint deposits mixed in with clay. And it's perfect for growing Sauvignon Blanc. And basically Touraine historically has been inexpensive Sauvignon Blanc.
Right.
Reds are really an afterthought here. If you you get them, they're going to be generally Cabernet Franc, simple Cabernet Francs or Gamay. Right across the river to the top. So we're on the Cher here, which is this river that's a tributary to the Loire, which comes down through, if you can see Tours there. Tours basically sits between the Cher and the Loire. And this little, down here it says Mont-Louis-sur-Loire. That's actually, it should point up across the Loire because that's actually over on the other side.
Okay.
Right there. And in that whole area where Vouvray and Mont-Louis is, the white grape grown there is Chenin Blanc. And that's because up on that side of the Loire and in between the Loire and the Cher, up on the north side, you have far less Flint. You have the same amount of clay, but you have far less Flint. But what you have is something called tuffeau, which is this super ultra soft limestone. It's almost like you can go in with your bare fingernails and carve yourself a cave with it. I mean, if you cut a brick out of it, you could use it in the bathtub as like a scrubby thing. I mean, it's really beautiful stuff. And that's the Sauvignon or the Chenin Blanc in this area just thrives and does so well in these over these tuffeau fields. Whereas the Sauvignon Blanc down in Touraine below there really likes the kind of harder clay and the Flint. So it's interesting because the Chenin Blanc has always just been the renowned grape from this region, whereas Sauvignon Blanc has sort of taken a second seat and is much better further up the Loire. So the wines from Touraine have always been pretty much pretty inexpensive Sauvignon Blanc. Then along come good producers like Roussely, who really kind of want to make a more elevated version of Sauvignon Blanc, and then also grow some red varieties. And because of producers like this in this area, they've actually only recently started a whole new appellation. So the wine we're drinking here, as you notice on the bottle, says Touraine Chenonceaux, AOC or AOP. No longer is it just Touraine. In this little sub-region in and around the village where this is grown, the INAO, or the governing body that controls the wine appellation program in France, has created a brand new AOP for wines of higher quality that are grown within Touraine. So Something to kind of look at if you're seeing Touraine that might be like twice as much as the one next to it. Something to pay attention to on a wine label. So
yeah, that's a great tip. When you are looking at a wine label, especially in a place like Touraine or in Loire versus Languedoc, like we just talked about, they're using the name of the place to describe what's in the bottle versus like Languedoc, where it says Picpoul de Pinet, it's going to be Picpoul. Like that's what it is. Languedoc has a little looser rules. They do what's called like IGT or IGP. They do vin de paix, so like just your table wine, but a step above that. That kind of gives you an in general idea of what's going to be in the bottle, but they typically are listing varietals where classically in Burgundy, in Bordeaux, and Loire, like if you're drinking a Loire wine, then you should know what's in the bottle. But again, as we're all discovering our kind of wine journey, that's what we're doing these for. There's no reason that the average non-French person or somebody raised in a very wine-friendly household should know what the 4 kind of or 5 main grapes of Loire are. And there's a lot of times there's not a descriptor on there. So
no, yeah, that's absolutely right. And especially with reds, you have a pretty good idea based on the village or the AOC what it's going to be. You get into something like Touraine Chenonceaux, you might not know. And so like in this case, hopefully it's on the bottle or someone's going to tell you, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on the bottle. And then when you're talking about the whites from the area, if it's Touraine, it's I don't know that I've ever seen a Touraine that is Chenin Blanc, and I'm not sure if it's allowed. And then when it comes to Vouvray and Montlouis that you can sur Loire that you can see on the map there, they're always going to be Chenin Blanc and not Sauvignon Blanc. But those are just things you have to sort of, just either just study or know, or just drink enough of it to sort of just remember. So once you taste it, you'll know.
Yeah, as far as your question, Alexander, AOC is Appellation Origin Contrôlée, which has then been kind of turned into Appellation Origin Protégée, which is basically this area of this like place produces this, and it's kind of a guarantee that if it says Touraine AOP or AOC on the bottle and it's white, it's going to be Sauvignon Blanc. If it says Burgundy AOC or AOP, it's going to be, Blanc, it's more than likely going to be Chardonnay. It might be Aligoté, but that's not a very common thing. Or if it says Beaujolais AOP, it's going to be Gamay versus Pinot Noir. So it kind of just guarantees that what the bottle says is what's in it. And that's very much a European Union and a French thing where, Italy has DOC and DOCG, so basically denomination origin contrôlée, so the same thing as AOC, just in Italian. And then with the G on the end, it means like guaranteed. So like it's an even smaller subset, kind of shrinking down as large picture of Loire Valley to Touraine Chenonceaux, and kind of like a zoom in of this, like what's in the bottle. New World wines don't quite have the same wine laws that France and Italy and Spain do. So you're still kind of having to wade the waters. If it's appellated in like with an ADA in California, it can have like 90% of the varietal listed, but the other 10% can be kind of a mismatch if it's just like region versus like if it says like Napa Oakville versus just Napa, it can be up to like 85%. And then if it's California, it can be all of these, places. Doesn't have to be necessarily all fruit from one spot. So it's, wine laws are pretty crazy, and every country does it a little differently. Luckily, the EU is kind of, doing that. They do it a lot with cheeses as well, both to protect the producers and the consumers. So if you're, spending $20 on a bottle of, Touraine Chenonceaux, then that you're going to get a quality product, versus if somebody says it, but then doesn't have the AOC or AOP on the end, then it could be kind of a knockoff version, if that makes any sense. You know, a big thing is for like in Italy, at least, is for Parmigiano Reggiano. So you know, if you have to have that brand, you have to have, you know, milk from these cows, and, you know, day 1 and day 2, and this, you know, has to be a certain weight. And so it's guaranteeing the quality for you, and then also giving some kind of benchmarks for the producers. So if you'll see that, especially on Italian wines, you'll see a little band on the top, right under the foil, or right at the base of the foil. And port for Portuguese, they kind of wrap them over. So you'll see those kind of indicators across the board, and it's just to kind of give you kind of peace of mind almost for, you know, what is in the bottle, and what they say on the bottles is what's actually in the bottle. I was reading, you know, this thing earlier about how corks are sometimes labeled with the vintner and the vintage because of how bottles used to be stored. They wouldn't necessarily, like, the label would basically fall off of the bottle because they didn't have temperature control 300 years ago. But the cork would have like what was in the bottle. So if you're presenting somebody a bottle, you open it and the cork still has kind of identifying lines on it. And it kind of all ties into, you know, I ordered a $400 bottle of wine, but you're serving me a $10 bottle of wine. And, you know, kind of safeguarding that, and also guaranteeing that this is what it is. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It maybe should be noted too, the AOC system is a French invention, and it kind of fits right in with the French proclivity towards bureaucracy. Right. They invented the thing back in the 20s exactly for, you know, the reasons that Zach has said, and it fits right into their love of like making things ultra complicated and having a whole bunch of people have to sort of sort through it. Every single area of France has its own set of rules that don't quite match every other area of France. And as you know, passed along to Italy and Spain, it's pretty much the same for those two countries as well. So you might get a handle on how it works in the Languedoc or in the Loire. It'll be totally different in Burgundy. Not totally different, but different enough that you got to sort of sift through it and figure out how the AOC rankings, that's probably not the best word, how the AOC levels work in every different area. But it's just, it's more fun for those of us who sort of love the learning side of wine, not just the drinking, but actually like, being able to just kind of keep exploring and learning about it. And it's the French will never stop giving you stuff to learn about when it comes to labels and AOC and stuff. So
and what's also neat is that they're constantly reviewing these things too. So 2 years ago, Rioja went from being just Rioja in Spain to having 4 sub appellations basically. And that's, for a som or for somebody studying wine, it just adds a whole nother kind of level, or like Jason just said, of like, okay, it's Rioja, but then this is Rioja Alta. And so these wines have this, more likely than not, a wine that says Rioja Alta on the label will have these characteristics versus Rioja Baja or whatever they are. And those are, again, once you kind of keep drinking, that's the easiest way to learn about wine. Not over drink, but just, continue to, then you can kind of, pick up on these things. And, hopefully if it's something, you'll find something similar in them that kind of resonates with you. And then you can compare them, like, as you drink more wines, you're like, oh, this reminds me of, Touraine Chenonceaux. But why? And then I have a Cahors, which is, classic French Southern Malbec. And like, okay, I can see the spice level or the tannin or the dark fruit, and you can kind of port that. And, as we've said a lot, you kind of travel the world without really traveling, which, hopefully soon everybody gets to do again. I would definitely love to go to Southern France. Jason, you do some wine tours, is that right?
Yeah, we do. I guess they're less wine tours as much as foodie tours, maybe. They started off as sort of wine tours, but you can, we would go to like, 8 vineyards, and I'm like at the end of a week's tour, so vineyarded out. I've seen so many grapes that I'm like, I'm not doing that anymore. Hopefully people want to go to like 2, and then we can do some other stuff. So it's kind of evolved away from just the wine stuff, but we do visit vineyards. We do, and we cook a lot. The tours have gotten smaller, which is better. We take a group of about 8 people and spend a great week in the south of France, exploring markets, historical sites, vineyards, and cooking, and hanging out in a really cool stone farmhouse all week. So yeah, if anybody's interested in hearing more about that, let Zach know, and I can. I mean,
I'm interested.
It's fun. It's super fun for us. It's been a terrible, it seems like a silly thing to, worry about over the last year, but it's been, really, we've missed being able to do that quite a bit in the last year, but hopefully we'll get it going again soon. So yes.
Cool. Alexander, do you have another question?
Yeah, I had a couple questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the first question is, so looking at this, the Malbec Cabernet, does it have AOC on
Yeah,
it?
so the AOC there is Touraine Chenonceaux. It should say right underneath it, very, you can hardly read it, but it says Appellation Touraine Chenonceaux. Okay, so you don't have to, Appellation Touraine Protégé is what it's saying. But the fact that they put Touraine Chenonceaux above that, basically it's AOP Touraine Chenonceaux. And it is a new AOP. I wish, I don't know exactly the date, but it's within the last 10 years, which is, new in the grand scheme of things with wine appellations.
Okay. The second question that I had is looking, I know in the beginning you talked a little bit about Malbec and Cabernet, and in the PDF we saw Cabernet in the region in France, but could you talk about Malbec a little bit? What's the difference between the two? Because the Malbec is 80%.
Yeah, so Malbec is probably best known today as being a big full body. I think Zach talked about it a little bit, big full bodied, much more fruit forward, but also rather complex wine out of South America, Argentina primarily. However, it's a French varietal. It's been in France since, I would guess, since the Romans planted it. I guess it's indigenous to the southwest of France.
It was a weird cross breed of way old heritage grapes, but then it basically got its start in southwest France.
Yeah, and it's in and around. So the southwest of France is a really fascinating area to do, just to study in general and to do wine tastings about, in that it's a big vast area that has a bunch of different appellations, but none of them are really contiguous to each other. They kind of exist as little islands in and around towns throughout the southwest of France, which is probably the part of France that people kind of know the least. It's sort of, this big alluvial zone above the Pyrenees, below Bordeaux, but all west of, Provence and the south of France. And every one of these towns that kind of have become these appellations kind of all have their indigenous grapes that kind of go along with them. And probably the best known one is Cahors, which is spelled Cahors. And the grape from Cahors is Malbec. So if you see a Cahors on a shelf, it's probably not going to say Malbec, but if it's red, it's Malbec, and that's sort of the original Malbec, and that's where it's from, and that's what it's kind of what it's about. And then as it's gone to South America and other places, it's become a different thing. It's still got Malbec character for sure, you know, and I'm a fan of Argentine Malbec for sure, especially good Argentine Malbec. I actually used to sell a really good one a long time ago, but it's very different from Cahors, that's for sure.
As far as Appalachian, Alex, think of it as an area. So like this area is the appellation. So it's guaranteeing that, you know, from, you know, 5 kilometers from this river until the edge of this mountain, you know, encompassing this square, you know, hectare, which hectare is about 2.5 US acres. So it you know, basically gives you a snapshot of an area. I can show you that, this big map again, and all of these, so all of the colored areas are appellations.
Yeah.
You've got, you know, like the light blue and the dark blue, but all of these colorful areas are appellations of the Loire Valley. And then depending on where they are, you know, this is again from Wine Folly, these kind of tell you what grows there. And, you know, again, like the general sub appellation. So if it's like Anjou, Saumur, Touraine, and then if you go to can't do this, you go over here, like they call it the center, but it's basically where Sancerre, Parfumé, like those, you know, more well-known smaller regions are from. So if you say like I have a Sancerre, then it has to come from this tiny little spot called Sancerre. Just like what Jason was saying, in Touraine, all of this orange could be considered Touraine, but then for the Chenonceaux, you've got, let's see, this tiny little spot right here. It should pop up in just a second. So all of the yellow is Touraine, and then that little spot is the AOP or the AOC. So basically think of it as like the big picture of the region, and then zooming down, and then zooming down and zooming down. An easy way to think of it is for Rhone wines. If you see Côte de Rhone, that's, you know, the AOP, and then you've got Côte de Rhone Village. So it's a smaller area, less amount of land can be used for the grapes, if that makes sense. Where like it has to be just more refined, and then you've got things like Vaccarat or Gigondas or Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which are the even smaller, that, you know, instead of 100 acres of land that you can pick grapes from, it's 5 acres of land that you can pick grapes from.
Yeah, and you'd think they could go through and redo the whole thing and make it really straightforward and make sense and the same from appellation to appellation, but it's not at all.
No.
It's very confusing actually. Like in some, you know, regions, if you've got a wine that has the word village attached to it, it means it's a more prestigious wine and from a smaller appellation, and in some other areas it's a bigger appellation and a less prestige. You just never know. You got to really just kind of know what you're dealing with from area to area. But generally, the thing to remember is exactly what Zach said. It just means a region, an area, and then it doesn't have anything to do with what grapes are there. I mean, some appellations have to be one grape. Some appellations can be, you know, 20 different grapes. They have some rules involved, but they, you know, they're not everyone has their own set of rules. So you just kind of have to know that. The trend these days, I should say, for winemakers and for the consuming public, and I think maybe it's the consuming public dragging the winemakers this way, but not necessarily. I mean, some winemakers kind of want to go this way anyway, is to kind of say, you know, I'm done with worrying about the appellations, wanting to be a part of the appellation. Consumers, a lot of consumers are going, I don't really even want to care about the appellations. Just put the grape on the wine and give it to me. And so producers will do that, but then they have to drop out of the appellation. And, you know, often these bottlings are just listed as a Vin de France, which is like the big all-encompassing French appellation where the rules aren't as strict. For better or worse, that's happening quite often. I think it's especially aimed at an American, drinking public. Although the younger French drinkers tend to like it too. I think it sort of feels less snobby to people. Younger winemakers are kind of interested in it because there's less rules imposed upon them. Because every appellation, there's rules for the producers as well. But it's, creating all sorts of uninteresting chaos and wines that you really don't know what you're going to get randomly from any given bottle. All that matters is who the producer is, and that they're going to be good. So to me, it's like, it's not necessarily a wonderful thing. I've had producers of mine who have decided to drop appellations because they didn't want to have to obey the rules anymore, or it was getting harder to, or they thought they'd have a bigger market if they didn't. And invariably, I kind of see the interest levels in the wines go down over time, because people just, they can only care about so many Vin de France with a catchy label. But if you're part of an appellation and you just keep doing your thing and doing, what that area is meant to do, your wines will always be timeless and interesting. So I don't know. I mean, there's pros and cons to both, ways of doing it, but it's sort of definitely a trend happening right now definitely in France in particular. You see it in Spain a little bit, not so much Italy, but maybe you've seen some too, but yeah. So
did you have a question, Alexander?
So I had a quick follow-up and then another question that I'll ask both. So short question, would champagne be an example of an appellation? And then full question, when we looked at the fact sheet on the viticulture section, I read that, and it talked about, or it emphasized that the organic methods of harvesting these grapes, for instance, that they use horsepower to do, and that they didn't use herbicides or pesticides. And I know in America, organic methods are important because of health reasons, but for wine, why is that important? Or is it important, or is it just a buzzword?
Your second question is huge, and we could spend a whole hour talking about it. And so, but I'll briefly answer your first question. Champagne is an appellation. Within Champagne, you've got appellations as well. Right. So you can have an AOC. Zach, you can correct me perhaps.
Yeah, well, when I think of Champagne, I think of it has to be the region of Champagne. So it's still like the in general appellation of Champagne. If Champagne's listed on the bottle, then it has to be from, the areas outside of Rheims and Epernay and all that, all of the cities of Champagne. And then if you kind of, deep dive, you can get more specific.
Are those appellations though, is my question. That's a really good question. I'm not sure if if Rheims is an appellation or not. But the best thing to just remember is that Champagne is an AOC, and it, obviously that's a big important one because not all bubbly wine is Champagne. And so it's important for, that to be an AOC. The question we're having is like, within Champagne, there's lots of different sub-regions that are important, and they're often listed on the bottle, but whether or not those things are actually AOCs or not, I don't import a Champagne currently, and I tend to be kind of myopic in the sense that if I'm not working with it, I kind of forget about it, and I haven't really thought about that question for a while. So I kind of think that Champagne is just an appellation, and the rest are just like essentially a lieu dit kind of situation,
Yeah, I mean, so I've got two right now, and like Champagne Lombard is from Epernay, and then Tat J is from Rhine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily.
It doesn't say AOC rim. No,
It
I think
does
it's just
not.
champagne. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's exactly where it is.
Yeah, I don't see any AOC, but oh, actually, yeah. So on the bottom of this bottle, in very teeny tiny letters, there is an AOC on the Tet and J. I do not see it on the Lombard, but it does very clearly say champagne on it. So there must be some kind of AOC, but I don't know as far as how reduced. That'll be a another kind of, we'll have to do a champagne wines day. I'll
Yeah, that's something to look into. I think it's just AOC champagne.
Yeah.
And then the other ones are just places.
It has an AOC on it, but it doesn't expound upon that. And I don't have any vintage stuff right now, because typically if vintage is in the house, it gets pretty much quickly drunk. It's, it's there for a reason. As far as your other question, I mean, the practice of organic, what we always kind of circle back around is that wine is an agricultural product. And if you're growing high quality, produce, you're going to have a high quality end product. The fact that these guys are using, manual, horse driven and, hand picked and all that kind of stuff means that there's more quality going into it at the start. So instead of running machines and just gathering all of the grapes, like in a bunch of bulk harvest operations, where they're just capturing everything, seeds, leaves, stems, whatever, and then sorting it after the fact, they're kind of removing that step and then hand picking and only picking the right clusters and potentially harvesting numerous times. And you don't have to worry about, a grape might look beautiful because it's been sprayed with a bunch of pesticides, but then it could be flavorless because it didn't have to struggle, which again, we've talked about the struggling of grapes and how lower yields can actually produce more intensely flavored wines, because if you've got a tomato plant growing one really amazing tomato versus growing 100 tomatoes, then the flavor is going to be in that one tomato is going to be kind of 100 times better than the 1% of the tomatoes all combined. And you can think of wine like that. As far as some folks definitely want it for health reasons. Typically organic wines have less sulfites added to them or no sulfites added to them. They're also typically using indigenous yeast versus manufactured yeast. The profile that you get, if you think of cheese, which I always kind of go back to, but if you have pasteurized cheese where you have milk, you pasteurize it, you add this culture and you turn it into, a brie or whatever, then it's going to be kind of one note. It'll still be delicious because it's cheese, but it's not going to have the nuances that if you had, raw milk that you then, just like let naturally coagulate and then form it into the same wheel of brie. The nuances are not going to be there, just because they've kind of like making it a clean slate and then tried to make a product versus taking something and letting it, kind of coaxing it along. The word élevage, which was also in that tech sheet, is like the nuances and the winemaking skill. Like, oh, we put it into a barrel for 6 months, but we, tweaked it, we stirred it, we rotated it, we made sure that it was in, the proper temperature control. So as far as, I think organic is a buzzword for some folks, but in general, wines that are produced organically, I think, can taste better. It ultimately will be in the hands of the winemaker, but it's kind of a slippery slope. We sell a lot of both conventional and organic and sustainable and biodynamic wine, but it really just kind of depends on what you're going after. That's a big question. We could, like Jason said, probably do a couple of installments of organic versus natural versus low intervention kind of wines. And this would definitely fall into that low intervention category, as far as letting the grapes do what they want, using indigenous yeast, using as little kind of man-made interaction as possible, and then kind of coaxing the wine into being delicious.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just briefly just kind of in some try to put my 2 cents in. I should say that all of the wines in my portfolio are organic. Not all certified organic, but it's super important to me, to the point where I'm not as a drinker or as an importer, I'm not interested in wines that aren't organic.
Right.
And for one reason in particular, and Zach mentioned it, it's that the most important thing for making unique wines is this word that we've overused for years, but it's so important. It's terroir. And the only way for terroir to be expressed in a wine is for the yeast, which comes from that terroir, to actually be the yeast that turns the wine from juice into alcohol.
Right.
And if you're not organic, it's as simple as this: you are killing all of the yeast that's out there in the vineyard and all of the yeast that's naturally on the grapes. Once that's all killed, you've got to replace it to turn the juice to alcohol. Replacing it makes every wine taste similar because you use the yeast, a conventional yeast that will, do a good job. It's way less problematic. It's easier to work with. It'll make a good solid product that'll work every time. But wines lose their character, and their character comes from the terroir, and it's the whole reason why we love wine and care about wine. So I think it's essential. It's not just an afterthought. It's the core thing about wine. It's the most important thing about wine, is to grow wines without using herbicides and pesticides. And there's tons of other reasons why flavor is, wines have certain flavors, or like Zach said, that one tomato is going to taste a lot better, but there's other reasons too. And yeah, we could go into it, but it's super important. And then from a health perspective, I mean, I do work with producers that are just like, we're organic because we got sick of being out there with chemicals every day spraying ourselves, and just for those reasons. But really, that's not even the main thing. It really does. It's the main most important thing for expressing terroir in the glass, and it's not going to happen if the wine's. Yeah. You can have good wine, but you're not going to really get the terroir that you want to have, which is, where the wine's from, the expression of where the wine's from into the glass, if the wine's not organic.
Yeah, and so I think you just answered Alexander's follow-up question, which was terroir is it's the sense of place, or the taste of place. So it's the fact that, it was sunny on Saturday, it rained on Tuesday, the ground had, 60% calcareous marl and some limestone, and then the end product, those little flavors that don't necessarily make sense. The earthiness, the flintiness that we're talking about, the other fruit flavors that kind of evolve. That's all. So it's the sense of place. The one thing I've not been to Chablis, France, but apparently if you've ever been to Chablis and you smell the air and you taste the wine, it kind of tastes like the air smells. And it's that kind of idea where you're literally transporting this, came from a tiny little village in France, and we get to drink it. We get to smell like the barnyard from the neighbor, and the fact that these grapes were picked on the 29th of September of 3 years ago, or whatever the intricacies are, and how it all kind of slowly plays into with a skilled winemaker, and what their end product kind of goal is. But it always has that sense of place is the easiest way to
That's a great description of terroir. Absolutely, because it takes in so much, and it is a lot. But it is sense of place, and the vehicle is the yeast.
Right.
The main most important vehicle, along with everything else that you might sort of ruin by using herbicides and pesticides. So really important. Let's not talk about biodynamics. We'll do that another time.
Awesome. Well, I think that about wraps it up for Wednesday. The next Wednesday is August 18th. So 2 weeks from today. Same bat time, same bat channel, 5:30 to 6:30. We've got some cool new wines. They'll be in the shop soon, right on top of the little charcuterie case with the fancy sign on it. If there's no more questions, I just want to thank everybody again for joining this edition of Wednesday, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks. Maggie, if I were.
Thank y'all. Very interesting.
Thank you for joining, Alexander.
Very good wine.
Good.
Thanks.